Okay, it's August 9th, 1994, about 10:40 in the morning. Just had a thought while looking through a mail order catalog of gag and gift items that I was seeing the Warner Brothers cartoon characters on various T-shirts and mugs in various poses, and also I saw Betty Boop and some of the other famous icons, fictional icons of our time. It occurred to me that a truly debased language, a truly debased set of semantics, might not involve words at all. In fact, the semantics might be symbolics instead. One of the projects I think I would like us to try and do is to take a simple concept, a simple emotional concept, and try to find cartoon characters that represent the vocabulary of this concept. In other words, if there is like Donald Duck when he's frustrated and jumping up and down because something is not going right, if there's the Tasmanian Devil when he's whirling around and ripping something up, if there's Bugs Bunny chewing on his carrot, Betty Boop in a particular pose, Yosemite Sam, all of these characters have a vocabulary attached to them that is nonverbal, purely emotional. And when we watch the cartoons, say the Roadrunner and the Coyote, we're going to experience the same emotion from person to person. That is a much more accurate way of dealing with D or desire-based semantics, as it were, as a code for creating a proper story form. Now, if we can create quads out of these symbols that have a culturally agreed upon complex emotional perspective, we might be able to create a complete structure of these emotions based on the nonverbal usage of cartoon symbols. Now, obviously, this is going to require something that would entail licensing these symbols. However, I don't think that would be a problem, since so many of these things are licensed anyway for public consumption, for us to be able to use them as part of a structural model for writers to be able to create different emotional moods should not be a problem at all. Now, interestingly enough, because the story engine is predictable, if we keep the relationships that we've established in the engine, but instead of putting the words on, put the symbols on, it'll be a most magical thing that happens to an author who's trying to create a mood, who wants to write from the organic perspective, is that they can answer questions by choosing symbols. Do you want your story's outcome to feel like this or feel like that? Or where among this range of options would best describe the way you want your story's outcome to be? Where would you like your story's beginning to be? At the moment that it opens up, how do you want the audience to feel as an establishing point, a base point? And you pick another symbol. And after you've picked a certain number of symbols, the Dramatica engine, using the new matrix of cartoon symbols, would do its little tricks, and it would then be able to say, in that case, as a result of this, the kind of thing that always seems to move the story forward, which we call catalyst right now, the kind of thing that always seems to move the story forward, and it would present a symbol which would give an emotional perspective of what it is that changes these relationships of feelings and drives the story forward. In other words, Dramatica engine would predict symbolic emotional representations. It would provide and put into each slot a different symbol to create a different appreciation by creating an emotional context. Now, obviously, cartoon characters are mostly going to be involved in one area, one superclass, one class. it's going to be in the area that involves the lighter emotions, because even when people are angry or mad, there's no real fear there, there's no real pain going on. It's that area of slapstick that is sort of unreal. We should try and figure out a comparison study between that feeling of cartoons, where we can have the entire range of human emotions from love to hate and happiness and sadness, and yet it is not serious, it is not something that when we feel the hate or the rage, it's not true hate or rage, it's through a filter, and consistently that filter biases cartoons in general. When we get into the more realistic cartoons, like some of the ones on Saturday morning with Transformers or something of that nature, then we actually end up with more of a real-world filter to what's going on. Now, we need to do a comparative study between these kinds of filters and the kinds of filters that we see occurring when we shift from the K-based superclass to, say, Hitchcock's superclass, Kasdan's superclass, or Fellini's superclass, that has to do with the relationship in the current model between the objective and subjective views, whether they intersect at the end of the story, whether they start intersected and spread out the story, whether they're parallel, and which one the audience is sitting on and which one the main character is sitting on, in terms of whether we can tell if something is real or something is fantasy, as it were. For example, in Fellini's work, or Bergman, we might see that that the audience cannot tell the difference between what is fantasy and what is reality. That difference, not being able to know the difference between the objective and subjective views, describes that superclass. Similarly, as we're dealing with these cartoon characters and the icons that they represent, that nature of Warner Brothers type or Tiny Toons style of cartoon separates the viewer from a reality base, and instead you're looking totally at the fantasy side. If we can identify those relationships, we'd be able to pick which superclass these cartoon characters fell in, and it's certainly not going to be in the K-based superclass. So indeed, developing the semantic model, even for use with a K-based system that requires defined symbology, perhaps what we're really looking for in the semantics are not words, but symbols that could be represented by cartoons. So that's rambled on a little bit, but it's just a thought that struck me, and I wanted to get it documented. So I guess, Mary, you'll be transcribing these now, I assume. If you would kind of put all this down, getting rid of the ums and the ers, and then pass it on to Mark for him to assemble it together in some kind of sense or order, and then have Mark give it to me in a more polished form, and then we'll present it probably to Peter so he can continue with the semantic model. Thanks. It's almost noon on the 9th of August, and continuing with that thought I had earlier, the concept of creating different symbolic representations to create emotional moods can be looked at as like supplying different keycaps on a computer, whereby you press a particular key and a whole different set of symbols will come up on each of the keys when you change which keycaps you're using. Now, when we're creating these overlay templates, as they were, we might be able to supply 3 or 4 different kinds of symbology in order to access the Dramatica engine for each of the perspectives we're dealing with. In other words, there would be the subjective story perspective, and that would have maybe 4 different choices. They conceivably could be mixed and matched, but probably it would be better, at least initially, to have each set be a completely different set of symbols trying to accomplish the same task. Our purpose in creating these alternate symbolics would be to realize that when we're trying to get to the heart of the matter and we're trying to be very definitive about emotional responses, nonverbal meaning, to get the organic side of story creation, what we need to do is tap into something that is nearly universal in its symbolic representation in our culture. As a result, these are floating meaning symbols. If you've only had a peripheral exposure to them, you may not know the context that they are intended to represent. If you are highly familiar with them, you may know precisely what they are intended to represent in terms of emotional response. The key is to be able to provide alternative symbolic representations so that if you have not been exposed to the one we present initially, you could then sift through 2 or 3 or 4 other choices and find one that is more attuned to your personal experience. Again, there are, at the height of our cultural intersection among individuals, certain symbols that mean exactly the same thing to every person that you might ask. But as you begin to get into the breadth and range of symbols necessary to describe an entire superclass, or, for example, we would then find that there are those who there just aren't enough symbols to go around that are universally accepted and understood. At least that's my expectation. As a result, if we come up with different sets of symbolism to go across the entire breadth of the superclass, from that which is most commonly appreciated to the areas that are more rare and less ventured into, we can tap a wide range of audience participation in terms of our authors. Authors as audience, as our audience, that they can jump in and pick the symbols that are most meaningful to them. Again, the danger arises if we mix and match between symbol sets. The consistency that is provided by Dramatica is somewhat lost. Certainly, each individual, if they understood the consistency that was necessary, could mix and match symbols to their heart's content and create a completely unbiased representation of symbology on the superclasses, the superclass semantics, that would work only for them because it would counter their own personal biases. Unfortunately, that requires a lot of training, self-awareness, and being able to analyze oneself objectively, which is not going to be the case for most writers, I should suspect. As a result, for the time being at least, we will need to supply all of these symbol sets as being all of one set or all of another, no mixing and matching. A way that later on we might be able to mix and match sets or to create a completely user-definable symbol set is through the use of colors and responses. Something like word association, something like symbol association, or Rorschach tests, where we could provide a set of colors, or undulating colors, or tonalities, or melodies, and after presenting one of them in a particular sequence, shifting from one to another set of colors or set of tonalities, each time we shift it to another, it's creating a new context by taking the original colors and then having another color follow. That's going to have a different meaning than if the order had been reversed. If we then ask a series of choices where the author would then pick certain other colors to be correspondent or that should be next in the sequence to make them feel comfortable or to make them feel that it is completely out of whack, or that it has taken a left turn instead of continuing along the same direction, we might be able to create within the program an analysis of the individual user. And once we have established just a few such touch points, we would be able to understand their individual biases, and then allowing them to pick the beginning point for a set of symbols, knowing this information about them. Dramatica could then generate the entire symbol set that would have the proper touch points to give the proper emotional meaning. Now, obviously, this is pretty sophisticated. Polling our P-O-L-L-I-N-G, polling our users to respond to how they feel about certain colors by choosing other colors or sounds, developing a profile of them, essentially a mindset in the Dramatica engine, and using that mindset to then begin with a particular color or a particular set of sounds and have the Dramatica engine generate keycaps or a semantic template, as it were, symbolic template, that would have the intuitive impact on that individual that would be a consistent emotional understanding of the model from one side to the other. Certainly it's not out of the question. It's just a matter of doing a lot of work. The technology already exists. However, as we begin to work, as mentioned, with these new symbolic, nonverbal representations, we should strive to begin with the universally accepted symbols and not allow mixing and matching between sets. Certainly it won't work all the time for everybody, but that's already the case with the semantic template, is the words that we have at the far end of the scale within the model, the areas less frequently used, those have more divergent meaning from individual to individual than the areas in which we are all mostly familiar. That problem, again, can only be overcome ultimately with an interactive polling of the user themselves to develop a profile of them that could then create a tailored symbol set. Even though it would still be consistent, it would be consistent from one end to the other only in terms of their individual perspective, and anyone else using that tailored set would find it quite warped, I'm sure.
It's Friday, August 12, 1994. Just a quick idea. We've been talking about putting together a book, a practical guide to how to use Dramatica. The users at the users group meeting last time thought this was a wonderful idea. It also occurred to me that we could do this as a series of essays by different writers talking about how they use Dramatica. So we may want to encourage some of our users through the group or through those who purchased the program to contribute an essay that we would put into book form. Ultimately, we may even decide to do a CD-ROM version or perhaps a videotape version or both, where we have the people who wrote the essays actually talk about that on screen. So rather than just reading their essay, they would describe it in person. Naturally, we would have to make sure that the people who wrote essays we liked were also good and inspiring speakers to put into our piece, but I'm sure that we could find enough people who have ways of using Dramatica to be creative, ways of using it as a tool, a practical guide to Dramatica, that we could put together a book, video, and CD-ROM.
It's Thursday morning, August 18th, about a little past 8. And as usual, when watering, I had another inspiration. It seems to be where I get my best ideas, when I'm watering the lawn. Anyway, I've been thinking more about that magic moment that goes between two binary states when you switch a light switch from being off to being on or on to off. You cross a limit line. At one point you have to say it's off, at the other point you have to say it's on, but something happens in that magic moment. Now, previously, I've been looking at some kind of force that comes in at the magic moment that's a waveform, and that waveform is what stands at the limit line. In fact, that waveform is the limit line. So the limit line's not a line at all, but a wave. And if you can imagine, like playing shuffleboard, and this wave is moving from left to right across the center of the shuffleboard court, that as it undulates, sometimes the peaks are moving closer towards you, and the drops are moving farther away, and so sometimes that limit line is closer or farther from your position. So if you were to take the shuffleboard, whatever they call the little puck that they have there, and slide it out, sometimes it might go farther than other times. Sometimes it might go less of a distance. And when it hits something, because the wave is actually undulating, sometimes it will hit it, and the wave will respond or appear to respond by moving away from you. Other times you will hit it just as it's snapping back or any distance in between. And if you hit it and the power is absorbed by the wave. When your puck hits the peak of the wave, as it's beginning to recede, then the puck is stopped in place, does not proceed any farther across the limit line, because all its energy has been absorbed by the wave, which now recedes. And when it comes back but not far enough to really push the puck very far. So effectively the energy is transmitted longitudinally across the wave from left to right, even though it came in at a perpendicular angle. And this is really the key to understanding crossing limit lines, is that you apply the force from you, say, going out towards the direction you're looking, and you're applying it to something that's going from left to right that is represented by a waveform, not a limit line. As you do this, sometimes the energy of what you do is thrown back to you with great resistance. Sometimes the energy you put into it has little resistance at all. But the impact of what you do energy-wise, depending on how you phase your pressure, how your pressure phases with the waveform, that determines whether you're going to be feeling a great amount of resistance or a little amount of resistance. When we talk about shuffleboard, we're talking about one single quick motion, a momentary application of force, almost like the notion of a particle of material that's so small that it can't be actually measured, can't actually exist, because if it has any size at all, it's not truly a mathematical point. Well, we're talking about a mathematical point of energy. In other words, an application of force, or an application of a vector of force that has no duration rather than no size. Now, when you do that, you strike the wave at that one particular time, and in striking it at that one particular time, you will either feel zero resistance or 100% resistance. Those would be the limit lines then, but they'd be limit lines of force, not limit lines of position. And somewhere in between would be the actual amount of resistance you would feel. The more resistance you feel, the less of the energy you have applied has actually affected the wave longitudinally. The less resistance you feel, the more of your energy has gone directly into that sideways motion into the wave. Now, the sideways motion into the wave is going to have an impact on the wave. If you have anything less than maximum resistance, the wave itself will be altered. What will happen to the wave? Well, it could increase in frequency, or it could increase in amplitude. Either way is an acceptable response from the wave. Generally, when we're looking at crossing limit lines, we're going to be talking about crossing spatial limit lines. If we cross temporal limit lines, where something is one kind of process and changes into another kind of a process, that's a different ballgame. Crossing the limit line where we are changing one process into another would alter the frequency of the wave. That's the part of the force we'd be looking at. But when we're talking about crossing a spatial limit line, like flipping a light switch, it's the amplitude of the wave that we want for our model. So this amplitude versus the frequency, those two things would be the spatial and temporal ways of looking at things. Now, the phasing of the wave and the wavelength of the wave would be what would affect limit lines that have to do with mass and with energy. But for the moment, let's stick with the spatial view and talk about increasing the amplitude as we apply our force. Now, if you apply a steady force, then the steady force that you are putting onto this wave will have no impact, zero impact. Because every time that you are pushing on it, the wave varies in degree. And so you're instead of having a puck, suppose that you actually had a bar, and you stuck the bar out there towards this wave that's going longitudinally from left to right across your field. And instead of just hitting it with a single momentary point that exists only mathematically, suppose it's something more or less, well, not less, but suppose something more than that. We don't want to get into negative space here. Negative energy, anti-energy. We take a bar and we poke it at this wave, and we keep pressure on the wave so that when it recedes from us, we continue to apply pressure. When it comes towards us, we continue to apply pressure. And effectively what happens is all we do is we shift the wave farther from us. We're not really affecting anything about the quality of the wave itself. And so we're only pushing it away. We never cross the limit line. We only move that
undulating snake-like limit line farther away from us, or conversely, we could be pulling it towards us by attaching ourselves to it and pulling at all points in the phasing. What happens when we cross a limit line is that waves have different frequencies. When we have a wave that has a very long frequency, that means we, within our realm of normal time, as opposed to microscopic time or macroscopic time, that if we are seeing limit lines, one way to perceive them is as being macroscopic waveforms. In other words, the wave is so slow-moving that it appears to be a straight line, and therefore we can push only when it's at a particular peak or a particular trough. We can approach this limit line and have what appears to be a linear impact on it, because we can limit the application of our force very close to what would be a mathematical moment, a single moment, as opposed to a single point that actually has no duration of time at all. The absolute efficiency in transfer of energy from the forward thrust to the longitudinal thrust of the waveform depends upon narrowing the impact of our force so that it falls within the shortest time possible, covers the smallest amount of curve of the wave pattern as possible. And as we then strike it at that point, it becomes almost a mathematical moment. And this particular moment then will have an impact in which all of our force virtually, almost all of our force, virtually all of our force, is applied into changing the nature of the wave, either increasing its amplitude or increasing its frequency. Now, we'll notice this has a similarity to when we're pushing a child on a swing. If the child is swinging back and forth, we have them swing away from us, they swing back, and at the moment they reach their highest point, we apply energy and let go as they begin on their downward motion. We do not apply it over the entire course of their wave that undulates back and forth. We only hit it at the moment that it peaks on our side. And then, of course, it has a peak on the other side and all of the range in between. It's a simple sine wave that's being created. We apply the force to this wave, and in fact, the wave is moving longitudinally to us because it is going from left to right. We can see that it seems to be a motion toward and from us because we're only watching a single point where we apply the momentary pressure, force. But as it moves forward towards us, that's not the wave, that's just a point that's riding the wave, as it were. And the wave itself is moving from left to right because that's what it describes over the flow of time. So in this scenario, we can see by that example how it's very clear that hitting just at that one moment will have a particular impact. Now, when we get into very fast waves that can be very high frequency, it means that their frequency may be so fast that we cannot apply force and then take off force without covering a great number of undulations of the wave. Because of this, it's as if we applied to the wave force continually, as if we ran behind the child and continued to apply force the whole time that the child was coming towards us. And when that happens, then you end up with something like pushing the child all the way around and over the top of the swing and back down the other side, and they wrap up around it. When they wrap up around it, you're ending up going into inverse functions in trigonometry. It's the same equivalent. Only problem is we can't allow it to go past the point of the peak on either side, the nadir or the zenith of the wave, because that violates the integrity of the concept of a function. So we limit ourselves to only describing what happens during this half of a cycle of the inverse function motion. Now, in fact, if we look at the waveform as being going from left to right, all of a sudden now we have a circle that goes away from us and comes right back around the top and comes back. But in order to do that, our position has to change. That's why inverse functions are having such difficulty in trying to describe some of the nonlinear and relativistic things that are happening, is that we're actually changing our dimensions to a dimension perpendicular to the one in which we normally observe a function, and we create our circle sideways to our waveform, so that the circle is actually in the vertical plane as opposed to the waveform, which is in the horizontal plane. And that can't be allowed when you're dealing with math because it violates functional integrity. However, it is something that's actually occurring. It should be described completely in its circular pattern, which in this case, because it is a circle and has to be tied because of the force to the inside, it actually is sort of winding up and becoming a spiral. When you're winding up and becoming a spiral, you'll notice that the waveform of pushing the child away from you and coming back is not truly just a waveform, but because it describes an arc because of their tethering. Now that we're looking at this arc shape of the wave, we're beginning to move it into an extra dimension. It's not just a flat horizontal plane, but it dips below the plane and above the plane, or that kind of changes the relationship in the vertical plane as the child moves away from you, rather than just sliding back and forth like the pucks on whatever that game is, shuffleboard. But when you have that kind of a vertical motion, one of them describes an arc that repeats back and forth, much as a skateboarder might go up and down the sides of a rounded swimming pool. However, if you go all the way around on that tether, if you push it so that you apply continuous force, then it goes all the way around and wraps itself around and becomes a spiral. So those two kinds of forms are also available, and out of the four that we've seen, one describes mass, one describes energy, one describes space, one describes time as the baseline of measurement for what's happening with the interaction between the force and the waveform. Now, keeping all this in mind, when we have a high-frequency wave and we apply energy to it completely, all it does is move it up and down the scale, because we're actually touching it all the time, if it's not tethered like a child on the swing, but if it's like the shuffleboard, and we push the entire waveform away from us, meaning that we actually have a sliding scale kind of approach. And this leads to the two kinds of effects that we see most often from our cultural bias, which is based on the binary, is that something's binary or it's not. Now, when something's not binary, we see it as a sliding scale. That's the only culturally acceptable alternative perspective. Naturally, we're getting into nonlinearity now, which opens up a whole new realm. And relativistically speaking, in mental relativity, that opens up the fourth view, covering all four of the dimensions we can perceive, but we have a cultural bias to see only the spatial and the temporal, the binary and the non-binary. Now, creating this non-binary view, it just means we have an impact that doesn't change the nature of the wave at all, because it's constantly applied, but it moves the wave farther away from us or closer towards us. When we have the force that's applied, but only over a portion of a single cycle of the wave, it actually changes the nature of the wave because it's unevenly applied. Now, obviously, from the moment you start to apply a wave to the moment that you end applying it, depending on where you begin to apply it in the cycle and where you let loose, will have the effect of slightly altering the wave even as you move it away and from you and toward you, unless you happen to attack the wave and release from the wave at exactly the same point in the cycle. When you do not, that is the nature of nonlinearity, where it's actually changing the nature of the wave in unpredictable ways. Sometimes a small change in your phasing as to where you attack the cycle versus where you release from the cycle, that small change in phasing can have a very tiny impact on the nature of the wave, and other times it can have a very great impact. So this is where nonlinearity is beginning to look at the interaction between the vector of force and the waveform that it's approaching. In other words, the relationship between linearity and waveform. Now, ultimately then, there are two kinds of things that we can feel that we are having a steady impact on. One in which the frequency of the wave is so great that we apply over many, many cycles of the wave our force. That's the smallest duration we can achieve, and then we see ourselves as just simply sliding it up and down on a scale, changing its value. Whereas when we have something that has such a long waveform that we only perceive it as a straight line, we can almost achieve that mathematical moment of applying the force just for a little bit. And in applying it for just a little bit, we end up having the impact of changing the nature of the wave itself, and it appears to go nowhere. One kind of force moves things on a sliding scale, changing their value in terms of in context to their environment. The waveform is here, now the waveform is there. The other kind changes the nature of the waveform. It is this, now it is that. Each one is actually a progression that's occurring by virtue of where we attack the waveform. An example would be around the house wanting to keep it clean and neat and orderly. In doing that, I had applied myself to every night trying to put together a half hour's worth of time that we would all work together, or to keep reminding the kids about doing their chores. The problem in not having any positive impact was that I was using the inappropriate frequency of the application of my force to create the change that I wanted. Now, if the change that I wanted was merely to get the house clean, then a steady application of force upon them would get them to do the job, and the job would be done, and the house would be clean. But I found the steady application of force was not easy to come by because it required a lot of my energy to keep applying that force, and it drained me. In this particular case, the amount required to get the impact I wanted was not appropriate. However, if I were to change the nature of the way the kids looked at housework, the way the rest of the family looked at housework, I could do that by timing very light application of force from here to there to get them interested in doing the chores. Now, the first thing I did was to stop applying any force at all. I just stopped doing chores at all. I didn't even mention chores. I didn't even want to hear about chores. And in doing that, I had been actually pushing them away from doing it by trying to apply my energy to it. When they no longer had any force applied to them as a value that was a steady value, slid back to a point where they began to then cycle through it, and sometimes they would clean and sometimes they wouldn't. And although it wasn't at the level that I would have liked to have a clean house, it made the house cleaner by my not doing anything. So by not working at all, as Chris says, sometimes you have to push things to make them come towards you. In this case, sometimes you have to stop pushing things to make them go away. And in that case, I had stopped applying force at all, and it actually allowed things to proceed in the direction that I wanted them to a little bit more. However, an even more efficient way, excuse me, a way of getting what I want more, which does require a little bit more energy, but not as much as before, is to simply attack the waveform consistently, to phase myself with it, so that when there is a wave that comes in, I can make it change its amplitude, or I can make it change its frequency, which is what's coming in here. I want them to more often clean up the house. And also I'd like them to do it with a little greater degree of that. Within the closed system, we're looking at the wavelength and the frequency are tied, and the amplitude is tied in with the energy. So you can actually accomplish both at the same time by the proper application of force, how often you apply the force. Remember that you can really alter the nature of a wave by applying force in such a way that you hit like every third or every fourth waveform. When you are hitting every third or every fourth cycle at the same point, you begin to not only create an undulation that changes the nature of the simple wave, but you actually start creating a subcarrier, because you begin to create waveforms that undulate the waveform. The two ways of doing this, again, are on the macroscopic or microscopic level. At the macroscopic level, you take the waveform and you can make it begin to undulate like a snake, so the waveform itself not only has the waves moving toward and from you, but the whole length of it, as if it were a snake, it begins to undulate toward and from you with the waves rippling along its back. Now, when you do this, you've created a long wave pattern that is working in conjunction with a short wave pattern. And as a result, there are times in which there are multiple peaks and multiple troughs, so that instead of having a smooth progression, you can see that things come together and pool and focus at one point, or dissipate and become practically non-existent at another. This is what leads to such things as retrograde motion of planets. When you are creating the microscopic effect,
you're doing the same kind of thing. If the snake is seen as undulating back and forth, then you're actually creating those little waveform patterns along its back. In one case, the little waveform patterns along the snake's back exist and the snake is straight. You go in there and you hit it at the right moment, and you can make the snake's back begin, the snake itself begin to form a wave pattern, and it still has upon it all these little waveforms that are along its back. However, in the other case, you have a snake that is already, its body is already bent into a waveform, and you use a high-frequency application of force applied with a particular phasing, and you can create the undulations that run along its back. The result is you're dealing with differing degrees of magnitudes, differing frictal dimensions. This is where frictals come into play, is that you begin to impose similar patterns upon other patterns until you've created nested patterns that are riding upon each other, processes within processes that appear to be one complex process, when indeed, if you look at that in a frictal manner, you can see that it's merely a series of nested waveforms acting as subcarriers upon subcarriers upon subcarriers. The greatest that we can appreciate is to look at the snake and say there is a microscopic waveform upon the snake and a macroscopic waveform upon the snake, and then there is the snake. When we try to go to the fourth dimension, we begin to lose it in our own minds. Again, the example we use is a coiled rope. So anything beyond that realm, although it can be calculated, will not be anything in which we perceive any value, because we cannot see it while looking at the lower level. We cannot see the higher. While looking at the higher, we can't see the lower. So in terms of a particular context or a particular desire or purpose, anything that we can define in a K-based society as being what we want to examine, that will have to limit itself to 3 levels, because the fourth one will have no meaning within that context. Anyway, this now can all be taken and applied to interpersonal relationships in terms of phasing in and out of favor with people. When you're talking to somebody that you want to get to know better and you're talking with them on the phone, how often do you call them? At what point in the day do you call them? At what point in their weekly schedules or monthly schedules do you contact them? It can be used in terms of sales to calculate the best time, almost like biorhythms, only based on the natural cycles that we can analyze someone to be going through. And similarly, using the engine of mental relativity, we can take the complex wave patterns that we see in ourselves, and by notating how they undulate into points of focus and diffusing in generalizations, the engine is quite capable of breaking that down into its particular independent, simple waveforms, so that we then can calculate exactly where to hit with how much force and how often the particular waveform we want to, without affecting the others, to create the overall impact we're looking for. It's a complex equation, but completely doable within the context of the existing mental relativity engine. So, as we start talking about when we have our meals, when we feel our energy during the course of the day, whether we're a morning person or a night person, when we go through cycles of PMS, when men go through cycles yearly of having more or less testosterone based on the time of year, when we start considering our finances, when we